This is an explanation for why all these other pollsters have the Liberals so far in the lead. And in our gut, we've known that something was off. And now we actually see data that proves that it's true. David Coletto, he is the CEO of Abacus Data. Abacus Data has been one of the more trustworthy pollsters out there. There's not many, but he's been one of the more trustworthy ones. And there's been some chatter online. Vesper has done some analysis on this, and he posed some questions about a lot of these pollsters and some of their relations to different left-leaning individuals. We already know that Frank Graves of Eagles Polling is biased beyond belief because he admitted it years ago when Pierre Poilievre ended up becoming leader, and he publicly stated that he will do anything that he can to ensure that Pierre Poilievre never becomes prime minister. I don't make idle threats, quote unquote. Subsequently deleting that. So it's interesting that shortly after there's been a lot of talk about what's going on with the polls, that David Coletto ended up dropping some interesting conversation on X. And I applaud him for this. I really, really do. And he was saying some very, very interesting things without saying them. He has to keep it professional. He has to keep it respectful. But on Northern Perspective, we have the option of reading between the lines. What lines am I talking about? Well, let's take a look. So he begins here. Personal note from David Coletto. Some people assume that when pollsters debate methodology, there's a partisan agenda hiding underneath. I want to be direct. That's not what's happening here. At least, not from where I sit. That's the first indication. I care about how we weight surveys because accuracy is the whole point. If our samples systematically overrepresent certain kinds of voters and underrepresent others, we aren't measuring public opinion. We're measuring a distorted version of it. And a distorted read, regardless of which direction it tilts, leads everyone astray. Governments, journalists, advocates, and citizens trying to understand where their country actually stands. Getting the method right isn't about helping one party or hurting another. It's about earning the right to say, this is what Canadians actually think. This is how he opens this. And I think this is very interesting. And some things in here that I catch is that he thinks, well, I can't say what he thinks. What I read from this is that there's other pollsters other than Abacus who are partisan. And what I also read from this is something that we actually had some conversation about a Northern Perspective with NP Nation back during the election, where all the polls all of a sudden just suddenly swung all the other way. And we had thought, well, this is interesting. And then we saw some other, mystery pollsters just jump into the fray that haven't been around for either years or ever. And they were all just pushing Liberal support in their polls, which was skewing the aggregate on 338. So it moved further and further and further and further. And this is what David is saying here. He's saying, listen, governments, journalists, and citizens, the electorate, are looking at polls, and they're looking at them to understand what is going on in this country. So if you're providing a distorted view of data and you're saying that the Liberals are, well, they have a very high level of support and maybe that's a distorted view, then what you're doing is you're presenting information that could be distorted to the average person in Canada, and that could sway their opinion or, at the very least, change their understanding of what's going on in Canada. That's what he's saying there. And in a nutshell, that's what we were saying last year. I think everybody remembers this conversation that we were having, and that's when we told everybody, stop worrying about the polls. Looking at behavior, not just characteristics. If demographic weighting cannot fully correct for imbalance, what can? One answer is to look at behavior, not just characteristics. Asking people how they voted in the last election gives us a benchmark that reflects the actual electorate. It allows us to compare the partisan composition of our sample to a known outcome and adjust accordingly. If a group of voters is systemically underrepresented in your sample, and that underrepresentation is not fully explained by demographics, then waiting to match the actual distribution of past vote can help correct for the gap. What he's saying here, and I'm not showing the whole thing because it's very, very long, but what he's saying is when you're polling people, you're not getting a sample of 100,000 people from across the country. You're getting a sample between 1,000 and 4,000. So how do you ensure that that's accurate? Well, you weight it. And the only way to do that is asking demographic questions and other types of questions. So what Coletta was saying is that basically all pollsters weight by demographic. You need to. That's important. But what he's saying is the problem is not all people that are polled are going to be representative of the electorate. So you need to correct for that, because what if on one day you end up with more actual liberal voters than conservative voters? Some people may say, well, that's just how it's polled. No, not necessarily. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So in understanding that, one way to correct for that is to look at how these same people voted in the last election, right? And that way you know, okay, were they partisan from the start? Or did their vote actually change? So if they're liberal now, but they voted conservatives in the last election, okay, now that's a legitimate data point that you can use. And then you can look at the different demographics of that individual and then where they are from, and then you can weight that accordingly in the overall poll. This is getting pretty technical, but there's a reason why we're going down this path. 43 surveys, 5 elections, 1 consistent pattern. We have been tracking recalled past vote since 2011, meaning people recalling how they voted in the last election. So they've been doing that in their survey since 2011. I took a sample of our surveys from May 2014 and April 2026 to conduct this analysis. Each survey asks respondents how they voted in the most recent federal election. Before we look at those answers, we weight the data by region, age, gender, and education to reflect the Canadian population. But importantly, we do not apply any past vote weighting at this stage of our analysis. That is deliberate. It allows us to see what a standard demographically weighted sample looks like on its own without any correction for partisanship. This is important, folks. Very, 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 very important. Cannot understate it. In every single wave, across every single election cycle, meaning the time between elections in government, conservative voters are underrepresented in our demographically weighted sample relative to their actual share of the vote. Not in most waves, not in some elections, in every case we can observe. 2 things stand out. First, the pattern is consistent. It is not driven by one election, one leader, or one moment in time. It holds across very different political contexts. Second, the gap appears immediately after each election and persists throughout the cycle. If this were primarily a problem of memory, we would expect the gap to grow over time as recall becomes less reliable, but that is not what we see. The bias is present early and remains relatively stable within each parliament. That suggests the issue is not primarily about what people remember or report. It is about who is in the sample in the first place. Looking at our final polls in the last 3 federal elections, applying past vote weighting increased conservative vote estimates, reduced liberal vote estimates, and brought our numbers closer to the actual result. In every election, past vote weighting moved our conservative estimates upward and our liberal estimates downward consistently in the direction of the actual result. The 2021 election shows the most dramatic correction, a 7-point improvement of our conservative estimate. So this is really important to look. What's happening here and what they're saying is what most pollsters are doing is they are not correcting and checking their representative sample in every poll for how they voted in the last election. So they don't really have an idea of whether conservatives are proportionately represented in that poll. And what Abacus is saying is that after an election, so after the 2021 election, the new cycle starts, meaning the time between that government, when they take power, and when another election is called, and that's when they're polling. So in that election cycle, conservatives just don't answer polls. And what does that end up doing? That skews the data towards the liberals. That's why you have lower conservative representative and higher liberals. So they show it here. So what they're showing is in the first column, where you see that 30% right at the top, they're saying in 2019, they took a poll. This is what the poll was right before the election. And it was showing 30% support for the conservatives, 36% for the liberals. If you look at the actual result for the election, they were off by 4.3% for the conservatives on an upward trajectory, and they were off by around 3% downward by the liberals. But if they corrected it for how people voted in the last election, they get a lot closer. And it's the same thing in the 2021 election. Conservatives were down by 7% from what how other pollsters measure versus what the actual result was. Liberals, they were over by 5%, and it's the same thing for the 2025 election. This is an explanation for why all these other pollsters have the liberals so far in the lead. So a lot of Canadians, a lot of people in this chat, a lot of people online have been saying, this feels off. And in our gut, we've known that something was off. And now we actually see data that proves that it's true. So they went back and looked at the different pollsters. Pollster 1 was the clearest outlier in the liberal-friendly side, averaging approximately 7 percentage points above the consensus. In early April, while the average suggested a liberal lead of around 8 points, Pollster 1 was measuring 14. At the other end, we and Pollster 2 were consistently measuring 5 to 6 points below the consensus. I raised what might be explaining this discrepancy in the lead up to the election. 3 remaining firms, Pollster 3, 4, 5, and 6, clustered closer to the average. Now, everybody knows who Pollster 1 is. Everybody knows who Pollster 1 is. If you don't know who Pollster 1 is, here's Pollster 1, because I went back and checked, and yeah, sure enough, this is Pollster 1. Ladies and gentlemen, Ecos Polling! April 3rd, 2025, they show a 15-point lead. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Yeah, Frankie Graves, right here. And it's funny that Abacus Data calls him out, but doesn't call him out. Absolutely hilarious. Did pollsters converge as election day neared? Kinda. But look at Frankie Graves. Like he's so off. Limitations, honesty, and what this means. It is important to be clear about what past vote weighting can and cannot do. It does not eliminate all sources of error. If there has been real large-scale vote switching since the last election, past vote weighting can overcorrect by pulling people back toward the previous choice. We saw this in 2025 with the NDP, where both weighted and unweighted estimates overstated support because of rapid vote movement during the campaign. As we saw, everyone moved away from the NDP to other parties. Past vote recall is also imperfect. Academic research does find that some respondents misremember or reinterpret the last vote. This is where David Coletto is being very careful, professionally. Quote, I do not believe that other pollsters are purposefully doing anything wrong. Every pollster should be trying to solve the same problem with the tools and evidence available to them, end quote. Very cheeky for him to say this. Every pollster should be trying to solve the same problem with the tools and evidence available to them. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more. This is probably the second most important part in this entire video. Our analysis suggests that in the current cycle, a demographically weighted sample could be underrepresenting conservative voters by about 5 to 7 points. If that structural gap is not corrected, polls will tend to show a larger liberal advantage than may actually exist in the electorate. This helps explain why our polling has often shown a tighter race than others. The difference is not what people tell us about their current vote. It is how we adjust the composition of the sample. Ladies and gentlemen, we have factual evidence right now, provided by Abacus data, that the other pollsters are getting it wrong. They've shown the data, and they've shown, especially when it comes to this is what the data shows when you do not correct and you only go by demographics, and it is pretty far away from the actual result when election day happens. This is Abacus poll right now, 2026. They did have the Liberals up by, I think, 11. That has shrunk to 6 points. This is what we've expected to see. That is very good news. That means in the corrected sample, support is starting to normalize and to go back to the Conservatives. And you also see the NDP up by about 2 points. That's a good thing. And all the polls that you see Nanos, you see Ecos, you see Ipsos, you see all these guys at 11, 12, 13, 10. But if they're all off between 5 and 7 points, and you correct for that, all of them should be around 6 or 7 right now. And that's a massive difference. It's a massive difference in what is happening out there in terms of the polling. Someone says, so who cares? It's what I said at the beginning. A lot of people are concerned with the polls because they're saying, well, the Liberals are up 12 points, they're up 13 points, they're up 14 points. But we just learned that they're not. And them being off by about 5 to 7 points, that has a dramatic shift in public opinion of what's going on out there. And people are swayed by polling numbers. We know this. It's the peer pressure effect. So if you're a swing voter and you're like, well, I don't really know what to think. Oh, well, the polls have the Liberals up by 15. Well, I guess they're doing a good job then. I'm going to go back to my life. Versus the Liberals are up by 6. But the media is trying to say that Mark Carney is doing a really good job. But if they're only up by 6, then people don't really think that they're doing a great job. Maybe I should pay a little bit more attention. That's why this is so important. This is wild because this is a pollster saying this out loud, saying what we've all thought this whole time, that the other pollsters are giving the Liberals a bias. And it seems that that's exactly what's happening. Evidence-based data shows that. So I'm hoping that this is going to give people a little bit of a different perspective on polls and the numbers that are out there, and that I would use Abacus as your baseline. Say, where are they at? And if everybody else is about 5 to 7 points above them, then you can pretty much count on, okay, based on the Abacus data poll, I can subtract 5 to 7 points off of all of the other pollsters, and that's probably the actual average that we're seeing out there. And even then, there's still a margin of error, right? Because in that one slide that I showed you, where Abacus did adjust for it, they were still off by a couple of points. But at least it's a lot better than being off by 5 to 7. Consider that. Consider that as we look at this. But that was a stunning revelation when I was reading that. And I salute David Coletto for calling it out, for putting it out there. And he did so in a very clever way. He didn't attack other pollsters. He didn't name anybody. It was pretty obvious to fuck who Pollster 1 was. But what he did do is he put it out there for the other pollsters to read it and say, I know what you're doing. And now you don't have an excuse to correct it.